Azure Role-Based Access Control, also known as Azure RBAC, is used to control access to resources within Azure. It operates on the principle of least privilege. Let's first understand how a permission-based model works. Let's say we have a resource and we can do different things on that resource. Let's call them actions. Then for each of those actions, we'll have a permission. So if we can do 3 different actions on a resource, then for each of those 3 actions, we'll have 3 different permissions. And if we want to allow a user to perform some of those actions, then we will assign relevant permissions to this user, and this user can perform that action on this resource. So if you see this, we have this resource, this is a scope and a user and set of permissions. So this permission is assigned to this user to perform operations on this resource. So this is a scope. Now, because Azure operates on a principle of least privilege, we have many different resources within Azure and we can perform many different actions on them. And in principle of least privilege, we only need to assign just enough permission for a user to perform their role, which means we probably need to constantly monitor and maintain the permissions assigned to a user. And we are talking about thousands of permissions here. And this can easily lead to a complex scenario and maintenance overhead. A better alternative is role-based access control, and that is what Azure uses. So now let's see how role-based access control works. So rather than assigning individual permissions to users, we create something called role. Role will have set of permissions and the role will be assigned to a user. So we have many different predefined roles within Azure. So for example, if you take storage administrator as one of the role, it will have a bunch of permissions required to perform the storage administration role. And that role will be assigned to this user. And we can also create our custom roles with a desired set of permissions and we can assign that role to the user. And then the scope is not just going to be an individual resource. We can actually create a collection of resources as a scope. But we cannot create our custom scope. We need to use the existing logical organization that we have within Azure. So we already know that we can organize resources into this hierarchy. So we have individual resources at the bottom layer and we can group them into something called a resource group, and resource groups are coming under a subscription, and subscriptions can optionally be put under something called management group. So these 4 are going to be scope. So if you want to assign a role to individual resource, you can still do that. So your scope will be an individual resource like virtual machine or SQL database. Or if you want to assign this role to this user at a resource group level, you can still do that. So your scope will be resource group, and you can also have subscription as well as management group as your scope. Okay, which means the role and the permissions within those roles will be applied at that level. So if a permission is applied at a management group level, what that means is that it will actually cascade down and it will be applied to all the resources coming under that management group. So we could have multiple resources under that management group because a management group can have multiple subscription, as you can see here, and they could have multiple resource groups, and ultimately they'll have several different resources. If a role is assigned at the management group level, then all the permissions within that role will be applied to all the resources ultimately comes under that management group for that user. Okay, so that's how it works. So you assign a role to a user, role will have a bunch of permissions, and then the scope will be defined for that role. So this could be an individual resource or resource group, subscription, or even a management group. So this is how Azure RBAC works. This makes things easier because rather than dealing with individual permissions, you are actually using a well-defined role to manage permissions, and Azure comes with many well-defined roles that are suitable for most of the jobs. But if that doesn't cut it, then you can actually create your own with desired set of permissions. Okay. Now let's understand a couple of more concepts that are relevant in the context of Azure RBAC, and these are the principles that are used in Azure security model. Okay. So the first thing is called zero trust model. So let's first see how classical trust model works, then we can actually easily understand how zero trust model is different. So let's say we have a corporate network. So this green box is a corporate network. If you want to access a resource within this corporate network, see we have different resources here, the red boxes. If you want to access any of these resources in a classical model, you need to securely connect to the corporate network. So the green box will be the security boundary. If you manage to get into this green box, as in if you manage to get into the network within the corporate, then you will be free to access any of these resources. Okay, so the security boundary is only defined in the perimeter. Once you get past that, you don't have any restriction in terms of what you can do. Okay, so this is a classical model. Once you get past the initial security settings, then you'll be able to access any of the resources without any issues. This is a classical model. But in zero trust model, what we do is we don't have any such concept of secure area. Okay, we treat every request as a potential threat and we will validate them. We will validate and we will make sure the incoming request is legitimate and has enough permissions to perform that operation. Okay, so let's say this is a storage account, you want to read from the storage account, you send a request, then that request will be validated to make sure you are a valid user and you have right permission to read from this particular storage account. And similarly, if you want to write to it, we do the same again. We make sure you are a valid user, then we make sure you have right permissions to write to the storage account. Okay, so that is how zero trust model works, and this is a fundamental security model used within Azure. And then another concept that is useful to know is something called defense in depth. This is, in a very simple words, rather than having just one single security mechanism, we will actually layer different security mechanisms. So that is why it is called defense in depth, because we will actually layer series of security mechanisms to avoid malicious actor from gaining access. Okay, so what are those layers? There are many layers, but the important ones are the physical security. So if you have a data center, the data center will be in a secure location. It will have high physical security. And then within the Azure itself, you can't access anything without a valid credential. So you need to have a valid username, password, or some mechanisms to identify yourself as a valid user. And then let's say we have a VM within Azure, and that VM will usually be within a network. And if you want to access that VM, even though you have credentials, if you want to access that VM, you should have access to the network that it is part of. If you can't access the network, then you can't access the VM either, right? So that is another layer. And the resource access. So if you take the VM example, even if you have access to the network, if you don't have valid credentials to access the virtual machine itself, then you cannot access it. So if you see here, we have several layers of security. We start from physical, then you need to have credentials to access Azure itself. Then you need to have access to the network. Then you need to have right credentials to access the individual resources or permissions to access individual resources. There are many different layers in between. I just covered most important ones. But the principle is we have many different layers of security. So that is why it is called defense in depth. So that is all I wanted to share about Azure RBAC in this video. I hope this is useful. Thank you.